Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12:35, and I think an appropriate time to start. A huge thank you for joining us today for this special event on early releases and homelessness, delivered in partnership between Clinks and Homeless Link, and intended primarily for the London voluntary sector, but with much of the information being applicable to charities and social enterprises working across England and Wales. So, whoever you are and wherever you work, you're warmly welcome today. My name is Matt Uberoy, and I'm London Development Officer at Clinks, supporting voluntary sector organisations working in and around the criminal justice system in London. I'm really delighted to be your co-host today, along with the brilliant Jeremy White of Homeless Link, who I will hand over for his own introduction in just a moment. Before I do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. The first is straightforward. Please keep your microphones switched off. You shouldn't be able to switch them on at the moment, but just in case something happens that you are able to, please keep it off. There are around 200 people on this call, and our presenters being heard clearly really does depend entirely on microphones being switched off. The second bit of housekeeping is regarding questions. We absolutely want them. We've allocated 20 minutes at the end of today's meeting to answer them. But please type your questions into the chat bar as they occur over the next 70 minutes or so. I promise our team will collect them all and will then read them out and go through them in the final 20 minutes. Speaking of the final 20 minutes, you're probably wondering what will be covered during the first 70 minutes. You'll be relieved to hear that we have a jam-packed agenda, which should be appearing on your screens as we speak. Thank you very much, Paul, along with the approximate timing. So after Jeremy from Homeless Link's introduction, we're fortunate to be hearing from Sam Julius, Head of Influence and Communications at Clinks. Sam will be outlining the latest policy updates on SDS 40, the temporary measure releasing many people not when 50% of their sentence has been served, but at 40%, and sharing how voluntary organisations have and can continue to have their voice heard on this issue through Clinks' platforms. We'll then be handing back to Jeremy from Homeless Link, who will be delivering a superb presentation on how the homelessness sector can respond on and around the two key upcoming early release dates. Jeremy will be outlining the very real problem of homelessness when released from prison, what homelessness prevention planning and accommodation pathways already exist in London, and why it's so important to work in partnership to better support people when released and prevent homelessness. We're then really lucky to be turning to Michelle Lindrum, Clinks' voluntary sector coordinator based inside HMP Isis in London. Michelle will be providing reflections and insight on what the early release process has looked like from inside prison, before handing over to me to provide an overview of what commission sector support is available for housing and what additional measures have been put in place, for example, next week on Tuesday, the 10th of September, when people in tranche one are released early. So lots to get through. Therefore, without further ado, I'm really excited to hand over to my co-chair, Jeremy White, Head of National Partnerships at Homeless Link, for his introduction. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that superb introduction. And as Matt sort of said, we're delivering this in partnership across ourselves, Homeless Link and Clinks. Really delighted to be here doing this in partnership together. We feel it's really vitally important for everybody in the sector right now, really wanting to find out a bit more about the SDS 40 scheme and what this means for homelessness services specifically, and that's across local authorities, other relevant public bodies, voluntary community sector organisations and faith-based groups alike. So as Matt said, I'm Head of National Partnerships here at Homeless Link. So Homeless Link is a national membership body for organisations working directly with people who are facing or experiencing homelessness. And I'm just going to share my screen very quickly because one of the key things that we do as part of these events, so this is funded through our London Council's funding. So this is their grants programme 2022 to 2026. So London Plus, or the Pan London Umbrella Support Project as it's called, really aims to support individuals and organisations working across all the 32 London boroughs to help develop their knowledge and practice. So hopefully before this event you will have received an email with the Mentimeter link and the code. It would be great if you're not there already. It's fantastic to see a number of people already are, but we'll give people just a minute or so to get there. So whether on your personal sort of mobile device or on your laptop or another device, it'd be great if you can head over there. and then we'll start to see people joining there and inputting information. And it's really important for us in terms of delivering these events. Feedback is extremely important. So understanding who's accessing these events and what you're taking away from them enables us to continue delivering events like this to demonstrate that impact back to London councils who fund us to do this. So I'm just going to flick to the next slide. It's great to see people coming from a whole range of different organisations, different types, sizes, all sorts. So really, really fantastic to have you all here with us, and great to see also a bit of a spread of people in London. But as Matt has rightly said, a lot of the information that we're sharing is equally as useful and relevant if you're not from London. So if you're not from one of the London boroughs, then you're equally most welcome to this event. So that's great. We've got a few minutes. We'll just keep that up there for now as more people join. So really great to see, again, just a really good spread of people coming from all different organisations, and it's so important the role that local authorities have to play in this. But if you're from another kind of local public body, whether that's sort of health or criminal justice or skills or other kind of organisations, you equally have an important part to play within this often very complex system. And equally, voluntary community organisations, I'm sure, of lots of different types and sizes, and fantastic to have faith-based organisations with us as well. Really, really great to have you all. Fantastic. So I think people are still continuing to join there. So great. And also, if you've just come into the meeting, fantastic if you can head over to menti.com, and then there's the code at the top there, 3562 2087. Right, so I think in terms of time, so people continue inputting on there, and also great to see as well, seeing how you rate your current knowledge of the government's SDS 40 policy for early releases from prison. So really good to see that there are many people here whom this is something new. So we really hope that you learn something from this that you can take away and hopefully feel a bit more knowledgeable or a bit more upskilled in terms of how you can, in whatever role you play, in whichever organization you work for, the part that you can play in supporting people leaving prison. And great to see that there are some people who are also saying they're very knowledgeable and also somewhat knowledgeable as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you for inputting on there. Yeah, great to see people still joining in. And as Matt said, we were really blown away by just the immense interest that we had in this event, and appreciate it is a very busy time for everybody. So we greatly appreciate you giving up your time to obviously be here and spend the next hour, an hour and a half or so with us. It's absolutely fantastic to have you with us, whether this is your first kind of London Plus or Clinks event that you've attended, or whether you've attended many in the past, you're most welcome. And what we'll be doing is I'll in a minute just be handing back over to Matt, but there will be a section later on in the session where we'll be gathering feedback. So based on what you've heard and what you've learned, a chance to feedback, how you feel now in terms of whether you feel more equipped or whether your knowledge has improved, all of that sort of things. So there'll be opportunity a bit later on to continue engaging in the Mentimeter. But I think for now, I will stop sharing and hand back to Matt.
Jeremy, thank you for that introduction. We can't wait to hear more in due course. And once again, thank you for agreeing to do the live Mentimeter technology. You're a braver and more competent man than me under pressure, that's for sure. when it comes to technology. So we're now going to hear about all things policy, and I'm delighted, therefore, to hand over to Sam Julius, Clinks' Head of Influencing and Communications. Sam, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. Lovely to see you all. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, all good.
Great. Paul, would you be able to share the slides, please? Thank you very much. So today I'm just going to give a little run through of what the SDS 40 policy is. I will start by explaining the acronym itself, and then talk a little bit about the work we're doing around homelessness amongst people leaving prison. Next slide, please. So SDS 40 stands for Standard Determinant Sentences, 40%, and it's a reduction in time served by certain people in prison serving standard determinant sentences from the current 50% to 40%. It has to be stressed that it's a temporary measure, which is going to be reviewed in 18 months' time. One of the key things to note is that there are exclusions, so it's not for all people serving standard determinant sentences. The exclusions include serious violence offences of 4 years plus, sex offences, and domestic abuse connected offences that includes offences such as stalking, coercive behaviours, and breach of restraining orders. There will be two initial tranches of release dates. The first is on the 10th of September, and that will be for sentences less than 5 years. And then the second is on the 22nd of October, which is sentences for 5 years. But this will be a rolling scheme, so it will apply to everyone who aren't within the exemptions. In terms of the numbers, combined 10th September and 22nd October, we're looking at approximately 3,000 people. And it replaces the endless custody supervised license scheme, which you may know about, which allowed certain people in prison to be released up to 70 days earlier than the original release date. One of the key differences here is that the time frame of this is allowed for a greater lead-in time to provide for greater resettlement planning. Thanks, Paul. So what are we doing around SDS 40? So we've been working closely with HPPS and the MOJ to convene the sector in the run-up to the first release date on the 10th of September. We've held sessions with voluntary organisations and officials along thematic lines. Today we've covered accommodation, substance misuse, CRS providers, women, families, and that was to create open lines of communications between officials and the sector, and to ensure that officials heard from the sector what they needed to be able to support increased demand, and also the sector itself could hear from officials about what was happening. We have subsequently shared all the information within these sessions with the participants. We're combining all of the information into a blog, which will be published next week. And then we continue to act in our role as that single point of contact for the sector so that organisations can share their concerns with us in SDS 40 and we can feed things back to government. Thanks, Paul. So when it comes to accommodation, we've heard some very specific concerns and challenges. Chief among them was around the specific accommodation for women. This is not something new, and many of you work in the homelessness sector will already know this, but time and time again we hear that there is insufficient, distinct, appropriate accommodation for women. We also heard concerns around partnership working, and there were calls for strong partnership working with local authorities on housing assessments, as well as kind of an objective interpretation of existing homelessness legislation. Going into that into a bit more detail, we're talking about aspects such as priority need, and lots of people leaving prison who should be deemed as having priority need are not, which is due to this subjective interpretation of how the homelessness reduction works. The other concerns centered around access to data. Voluntary providers require early and detailed access to data so that they can assess need, but also ensure that tailored support is in place. Fourth aspect is around CAS 3 provision, so that's community accommodation services. And this third tier is specifically temporary accommodation for prison leavers at risk of homelessness, provides accommodation for up to 84 nights. The concern is on making sure that they maximise the bed spaces that are available, as well as simplifying the process for voluntary organisations to access that accommodation. And then the final point was around referrals. commissioned rehabilitative services providers need those referrals as soon as practically possible, so that they can put in place the steps that are needed to support people. Thanks, Paul. So, SS40 has highlighted existing challenges that people in prison face in accessing accommodation. And these are challenges that we're aware of through a lot of the policy work that we've already done on accommodation. And I've listed them here. Chief among them is poor resettlement planning. Many organisations that work with people coming out of prison struggle to access prisons and able to put in place those steps over a longer time frame. I've already spoken about that lack of effective partnership working, and this is around voluntary organisations working with probation, for example, but also, once again, getting that access to prison staff to be able to assess and identify need. I've also referenced the ineffective application of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which is leaving many people in prison not being deemed as having priority need. And the fourth point is simply it's an insufficient provision of housing options for people leaving prison. This relates to a number of aspects. Chief among them is financial security. People leaving prison, many people leaving prison can be in financial distress. And as a result, the fifth point is that they have significant barriers to access in the private rented sector. So there is a greater need to access alternative accommodation options. The reason that this is an area that we've focused on is that homelessness amongst people leaving prison remains extremely prevalent. Nearly a quarter of people are not in housing 3 months post-release. And this is a figure that we hope to see reduced through policy change in the coming months and years. Thanks, Paul. So I referenced the policy work we've been doing. This is through the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group that we co-convene with HMP Isis and the Ministry of Justice. It acts as an interface between the sector and government. And as part of that group, we established a policy subgroup or a special interest group on accommodation. And what we wanted to do was to explore the barriers to accessing accommodation, particularly for people in prison. We have now published 3 reports, and the links are here if you're interested in reading them. The first report looked at resettlement planning, legislation, government provision. The second looked at access to the private rented sector, and the third looked at housing support. For those that do read the reports, we always welcome any input. If anyone has any questions, then please do reach out. Thanks, Paul. So what can be done? We've put together a range of what we think are some very practical and realistic recommendations, all developed within the context of an incredibly tight financial settlement across government departments at the moment. And here is a list of some of those ideas. One of them is around a cross-government resettlement framework, which would establish minimum levels of support for everyone leaving prison. The second one is about resettlement planning. What we want to see is, apologies for the buzzwords here, but essentially pre-release panels in every resettlement prison that enable for housing-related work to be done from a period of 6 months pre-release where it can be done. So they obviously won't apply to everyone on shorter sentences. We also want to see the provision of more departure lounges, which are based just outside prisons, as well as multi-agency wellbeing hubs in the community, which co-locate services in one location. I've already referenced a more objective application of existing homelessness legislation. And then the fourth is about an existing funding scheme, which provides things such as rent deposits for people who've left prison so that they can access private rented accommodation. Thanks, Paul. And that's it. Thanks very much, guys. As I say, if you have any questions about the nature of this work and want to have a chat, then I've put my email
on. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. So much in there. Really valuable policy detail, and really great to hear how many opportunities there are for voluntary sector organisations to influence these times through Clinks. Just a reminder, everyone, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat function. We'll get to it at the end at the allocated time. Once again, a huge thank you, Sam. Okay, everyone, we'll now be heading back to Jeremy White, Head of National Partnerships at Homeless Link. We'll be discussing SDS 40 and how the homelessness sector can respond. Jeremy, take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. And let me just share my screen again. Hopefully people can see that. If you can just confirm for me, Matt, that would be great.
Crystal clear.
Perfect. So yeah, I really just wanted to take 15 minutes of this time to really focus in on how can the homelessness sector respond to this new scheme. So we know that homelessness is a real and present danger, and for frontline workers who engage with people recently having left prison, an understanding of the criminal justice system framework and effective support options can really be a lifeline. There's a really high level of overlap actually between people known to criminal justice, substance misuse, and homelessness services. So there was a bit of data that came out actually between October and December 2022, so a little while ago now, which showed really starkly that people leaving prison in England experienced homelessness as measured by applications for statutory government assistance at a rate 40 times higher than the general population, which is really staggering. And also statistically, people who have experience of the criminal justice system disproportionately experience homelessness. And this can be a major factor in terms of offending and reoffending. In Nelson Trust's feasibility study that was produced several years ago now in 2020, of the women they interviewed, a staggering 0% were confident that they understood all their housing options. 64% did not know where they would sleep on the day of their release or knew that they would be homeless, and 50% did not in a previous release or felt that they felt they would not receive support into accommodation on their first day of release. One woman interviewed said that I've never had my own place, and this was partly the cause of me going on to reoffend again. And really important to be aware that any adult who receives a custodial sentence of more than 1 day will leave prison with a minimum of 12 months community supervision, a named probation officer, and in theory, they should have an address to go to. But many will also have had resettlement support prior to being released, yet despite that, individuals are often falling into homelessness and rough sleeping in the weeks and months after being released, and often at the point of things having broken down to such a degree, that's when people are likely to seek support or come into contact with frontline homelessness services. So just to make you aware, in terms of Homeless Link's role, in the context of the SDS 40 scheme, we're currently gathering information on different practices being used by organisations across the country. We've also set up, and we're in the process of developing a new web page that can be accessed via the link there. And just so you're aware, we will be sharing all of the slides shown in this presentation afterwards, so you'll be able to have all these links to hand. And we're also providing a set of tools and guidance for the homelessness sector in terms of supporting people who leave prison, and also best practices to adopt, some of which will be included in this presentation. Sometimes people are interviewed by staff from the DWP prior to being released from prison. At this stage, individuals should let DWP staff know which benefit they were on prior to being sentenced, as for example, they can restart a claim for universal credit up to 1 month before being released. Throughout somebody's stay in prison, they'll be assessed at different points and by different teams working on a range of factors such as housing, health, substance misuse, and so on. And it's important to be aware that most people leaving prison are subject to probation orders. And there are a couple of different things there for you to see on the screen. So in terms of people released from prison are going to be either subject to a home detention curfew or an HDC, or a release on temporary license and ROTL. There's the basic custody screening tool, or the BCST. That's one of the most important tools for preparing accommodation options upon release. And this should not only identify potential tenancies that need sustaining, but also enable any housing advice workers to really start planning sustainable long-term accommodation plans. For London, Ministry of Justice are following their standard pre-release procedures, including working with local authority housing and other commissioned housing service partners, with duty to refer arrangements being a critical element of that resettlement planning. And that will be very similar to other areas outside of London too. And this diagram hopefully just shows you a bit of what that journey will look like for people leaving prison, then presenting to the local authority, what that looks like in terms of there are lots of different processes that the local authority has to go through to identify relevant housing providers and homes for people. Also, there are resettlement panels that play a really important part. And then in terms of finding a home, but it's not just the home that somebody needs, it's what infrastructure is there around them in terms of community. It's really important. It's not just a home, it's community, it's thinking about work, lifestyle, friends, everything that you and I need to live a full life in that sense. And Ministry of Justice are engaging at regional and local levels with heads of housing working locally with their borough-based partners, including through local resettlement panel arrangements, as I mentioned. And additionally, the CAS3 transitional accommodation service for prison leavers, that's the critical element in preventing homelessness upon release. So in terms of preventing homelessness and reoffending, just a bit of background for you in terms of the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017. That subsequently came into force in April 2018. And what really that introduced significant changes to the previous legislative framework, in particular, introducing new duties on local housing authorities and public bodies to prevent and relieve homelessness. In addition, so in relation to people leaving the criminal justice system, we identified these sort of key areas. So providing advice and information about homelessness and prevention of homelessness in terms of the HRA 2017. The period of threatened with homelessness was extended from 28 days to 56 days. There's application of prevention and relief duties, assessments and personalised housing plans, and duty to refer, and really encouraging public bodies to work together in partnership. Local referral pathways are also really important when it comes to preventing people from becoming homeless, and these can only be developed and really effectively delivered in those partnerships between local authorities and other organisations, really all working together to address the range of complex needs that individuals may be facing. For many people leaving prison, moving into accommodation they manage themselves isn't going to be suitable, and that's due to a range of different factors. Some people who have experienced the criminal justice system have vulnerabilities around their use of illegal substances or alcohol, or suffer from mental health issues as well. This may mean that independent living isn't currently suitable for them, as it would place them at greater risk of debt, but also greater risk of homelessness as well as reoffending. And people who have been within the prison system for many years may be completely unprepared for life in the community. And this is also the case for people who have had repeated short prison sentences as well. Both present the individuals with complex challenges in settling and maintaining accommodation after recent prison sentences. So access to supported housing, emergency accommodation and hostels is almost always through a local authority. That often takes the form of a pathway with a range of different housing and accommodation services, really dependent on level of vulnerability and eligibility. So for example, through proving local connection. Many local authorities have specific offender housing pathways. However, due to lack of available spaces, emergency accommodation in bed and breakfast and temporary bed spaces might be provided for those on a waiting list for supported accommodation or specific hostel bed spaces. And considering the lack of available social housing that's currently out there, and the decreased supported options for people with experience of the criminal justice system, accessing the private rented sector or PRS accommodation can often be the best bet for many people leaving prison. For people with some savings, this can also be an attractive option, as they're able to overcome some of the financial barriers associated with renting. Local authorities should have information on a range of landlords and options relating to rent deposit, bond and guarantee schemes, but also staying with friends and family after release from prison is one of the most common routes of initial accommodation. But during the resettlement assessment process within prisons, it's really good practice to ensure that any expectations are effectively managed and that prison leavers are not returning to either overcrowded accommodation or to a social network that exposes them to the risk of reoffending. And really effective resettlement planning that needs to ensure that friends and family are both consenting in that process and prepared for people to arrive after release, and that further expectations are managed in terms of the planned length of stay. Accessing other accommodation options on the precise day of release can be very challenging. So often family and friends provide that crucial stopgap option between being released and then moving into more sort of settled long-term accommodation further down the line. It's unlikely that people leaving prison will have access to social housing via a local authority, and that's simply due to the shortage of supply and also the lengthy waiting lists I mentioned earlier. And any person leaving the criminal justice system who is found to be a priority need and placed on a local authority waiting list will either be placed in a short-term temporary accommodation bed space or with family and friends in the interim. And many local authorities operate strict housing allocation policies for social housing. And then final point on this one, so approved premises, formerly known as bail or probation hostels, are accommodation for people leaving the criminal justice system who have been assessed as being high risk. They provide an enhanced level of supervision and support within communities in order to minimise reoffending and maximise rehabilitation. And placements into approved premises are decided by the National Probation Service, and that's based on thorough risk assessments. And for some people living in an approved premises is a condition on their licence as well. Often individuals access approved premises due to being unable to return to previous areas where offences have taken place. And it's important to be aware as well that any individual who raises particular concern within their risk assessment will be referred to local MAPA or multi-agency public protection arrangements. So what's already in place? So Sam mentioned earlier, there's AFIO and CAS3, so we don't need to spend too much time on this, but you can see there those schemes were launched in July 2021, and approaches are already operational that support people in accommodation following a release from prison. In terms of what's working well currently, so initial information gathering and conversations with providers pulled out several key factors as supporting the success of CAS3 and AFIO schemes that we're aware of. So really important that you start early. The sooner you can engage with people, the better. So gather paperwork early, that sort of admin side of things. Housing options are absolutely key. It's vital to do housing assessments prior to release. You just got to get in there, locate housing options and advice services whilst in prison to make sure as smooth a transition as possible for people leaving prison. Avoid meeting targets for target's sake. Some people simply aren't ready for PRS. It's important to make sure that decisions aren't made prematurely to get people into potentially an even worse situation than what they could be in already. Personalisation budgets can be really helpful for deposits or rent or help settling in, and also building strong relationships with all partners, holding each other to account. That's really important in terms of that local partnership working. So when we look at working with local partners, as we've said, partnership work plays an absolutely crucial role in ensuring that people are supported appropriately and effectively after being released from prison. So you can see there are many different things here. So there's community safety partnerships, including serious violence duty, operational partnerships such as MAPA, as we've mentioned, but also IOM, that's integrated offender management, local safeguarding partnerships and safeguarding adults boards, combating drugs partnerships, health, including local drug treatment arrangements, homelessness prevention resettlement panels, and then pre-release panels as well. Protocols can be developed with key partners, including local prison, probation, policy, and local authorities. And what's good practice in terms of those policies is really describing the process from entry to post-release, highlighting key intervention points and clarifying roles and responsibilities, including timelines and contingencies, They may include visions, values, and shared goals. They should be signed off by named individuals who commit to reviewing, and there are examples that you can see on our webpage and more to be added as well, including the Scottish Shore Standards, which are applied nationwide. So again, the link will be provided with the slides. And then finally, just so you're aware, so MOJ have undertaken a range of planning activities since the launch of the SDS scheme. That's leading up to the 10th September 2024. So that's the first tranche release date. So thank you very much. I believe I have now run out of time, so I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back to Matt.
Fantastic. Jeremy, thank you so much for that. So much useful information there and a really powerful message about the importance of partnerships, something we all agree with at Clinks, and I'm sure everyone else agrees with on this call as well. And so hopefully this event will be the start of even stronger collaboration amongst many here. I'm seeing really good messages coming in on the chat function about people offering spare capacity that they have with their organizations. And we really are looking forward to joining the dots behind the scenes and making this happen. And once again, everyone, please keep your questions coming in the chat function. We'll try our best to get through them at the end. Okay, everyone, we're now going to turn to Michelle Lendrum, Clinks' voluntary sector coordinator based inside HMP Isis in London. Michelle will be providing reflections and insight on what the early release process has looked like from inside prison. Michelle, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Matt. So I'm the voluntary sector coordinator at HMP Isis. I'll give you a little bit of a run through in terms of my role and what Isis is like, and kind of go through some practical aspects of what Isis is doing in relation to the releases, as well as some information to take forward. And that's regardless of whether you're a London prison or not, because I'm trying to make it applicable to a variety of organisations and locations. So in terms of my role is really focused on promoting the voluntary sector within the HMP Isis and providing support to those voluntary sector organisations and identifying any gaps in terms of service interventions or support that we could provide to the young men at Isis. So I'll give you a bit of a background of Isis, for those who don't know. Isis is a HMP YOY, which means we house approximately 600 people in prison who are aged between the age of 18 to 27. And it's a Cat C prison, and it's based in London, and we're in a cluster with Thameside and Belmarsh as well. There's a bit of a background in terms of what Isis, in terms of the population ISIS and the cohort ISIS. So in terms of practical aspects at ISIS, we do have issues in terms of our population, our cohort having issues with gang affiliations and violence. So this obviously impacts in terms of how we work with the people in ISIS. So one of the things that the prison has looked at doing in terms of releases on the 10th of September is doing releases from 7 a.m. And we have 2 house blocks at Isis. There'll be 1 house block in the morning and 1 house block in the afternoon. And it will be releases per 1 wing per hour. That's obviously the plan. Whether it comes into fruition, how that will actually work, I don't know. But that's the actual plan that ISIS have put together. And that's trying to ensure that each wing and each hour will be cleared for the next wing to come along. Because like I said, obviously, because of the conflicts and the issues that may arise with the number of people being released from ISIS on that day. We obviously looked at issues in terms of safety. As far as I know, there is going to be police presence as well to facilitate, to ensure that the smooth transition between those releases and people are cleared for the next releases. As we are prison within a cluster, we looked at the issues in terms of Thameside releases and Belmarsh releases. And because the number is much lower and there's no major issues between our releases, there hasn't been a big issue in terms of those releases that day have been identified. So that's kind of the practical aspect of people being released on the day. Now, in terms of housing, obviously we do have housing support providers. We have St. Mungo's at Isis, and I'm obviously aware that the situation would be different for different housing support providers within different prisons, and the cohorts will be different. In terms of St. Mungo's, what they do is, obviously they work with the community offender manager making those referrals into the prison, and then the housing worker within ISIS working with the probation officer within the prison to ensure assessments are completed in time, referrals are made to local authority and private rented or whatever the scheme will be in the community. So that process that St. Mongos have undertaken at ISIS so far, as far as I know, is continuing still the same way. Obviously, caseloads have increased greatly because of those the SDS 40 releases on 10th of September. But as far as I know, the process is the same. And the process has been going okay because we have had information from last month about the releases that we have. So ICE has been prepared in terms of housing to make those referrals and ensure that's all completed. Again, our cohort is quite different. 18 to 27-year-olds, we do have a substantial proportion of those young men being released back to family. So because of that, it does reduce kind of like the stress about housing, and the number that we're working with would be smaller than perhaps adult male or female prison. One of the things that we have noticed in terms of working, having a discussion with housing about the SDSD 40 releases is that we do have we worked to a number of releases for the 10th of September date. However, in the last couple of weeks, that number has reduced. So what we're finding is the prison is trying to reduce that number for the 10th of September by trying to release people who may be eligible for HDC, for example, or other types of releases. But the issue that can cause is if we're working towards a 10th of September date, whether it's housing or any other provision that's working with someone coming out of custody, is that 10th of September date can then change to perhaps tomorrow, or we've had people be released 2 weeks early, but the housing providers only being advised within 24 to 48 hours. So those are very rare. And obviously, like I said, obviously in ISIS, which could be different prisons, but that could be kind of a setback and something to bear in mind going forward, which leads on to kind of things that I assume, I'm not sure if people will be doing this already or not, but kind of things to bear in mind within this release and this first tranche. I assume that most people that work in the prison will have access to NOMIS. So if you do have access to NOMIS, print off your discharge list and have a look at your discharge list for the 10th of September. That's more like a practical advice. You can have a look at who's being released. Every person should know they're being released on the 10th. Therefore, the providers and the people working with those people should have that information. So whether it's ID, bank accounts, those provisions should have been picked up by that point. So yeah, check the discharge list for the 10th of September will be really, really important, and do it on a daily basis. Because I think that's whether it's housing or not, check that on a daily basis because you could be working to a 10th of September date. However, if they were eligible for HDC and there's a chance we can get them out on HDC earlier, they could come out and you could get 24 hours to 48 hours notice. So that daily churn, that can happen. So especially coming up to that date next week, just keep an eye every day. If you don't have access to NOMIS and you work in a prison, try to ask your point of contact. That'd be really useful for you in terms of practical advice. Obviously, in terms of ISIS, I'll work very closely to the head of reducing reoffending and the head of OMU. So I would suggest if you could either establish that relationship or find out who they are or ensure that you stay in the loop. So having those conversations with those members of staff to know exactly what is happening, to identify any concerns will be really, really important for in terms of the service being provided at ISIS to ensure that we can provide that through the gate service and identify any concerns within this first tranche. HMP Isis do hold a monthly reducing reoffending meeting, which is really useful for all of us to attend. And obviously different prisons will have a different setup. So it could be you have weekly release planning meetings or other types of resettlement planning meetings. I would suggest try to attend those, especially the ones between next week and the 22nd of October, because this is when you guys can discuss and sit down in terms of identifying any concerns that you've identified from the first tranche. I think this kind of interim period is a really good opportunity to discuss with your fellow colleagues from different services so you can work together. Like I mentioned before, ID, bank accounts, mental health, anything like that with housing, as well as raising any concerns that you may have had with the prison. So if you've had any problems in the first tranche, let's see how we can kind of rectify that for the second tranche. So I would suggest kind of having that relationship with OMU, head of reducing reoffending, sharing information, being kept in the loop, attending all those meetings would be really crucial to kind of ensure that a smooth transition as much as possible, because, you know, this is obviously unprecedented, and we want to make sure that for at least for the second tranche, we have learned enough to ensure that we can, you know, rectify any issues and kind of magnify anything that was kind of a positive bit from the first tranche. So, you know, like I said, hopefully it's kind of giving you a bit of a heads up in terms of what's happening on the ground in terms of ISIS. Again, with the cohort, I know we mentioned this before in the slide, the 10th of September tranche will be for those being sentenced to less than 5 years, and the 22nd of October for those sentenced to more than 5 years. So for ISIS, for example, we're category C prison, and we have got mostly young men sentenced to less than 5 years. So our tranche on the 10th of September will be a busier one than one on 22nd of October. So something to bear in mind. If you work in adult male prison, adult female prison, you've got mostly people being sentenced to more than 5 years, then be prepared that your 22nd of October tranche will be busier. And this is when you need to kind of bear that in mind in terms of the cases you're working with and identifying any concerns or issues that you may have had from the first tranche. So, I mean, hopefully that's kind of giving you a bit of information. Like I said, it's a London prison, it's a HMP YOI, things will be done different in different prisons, but it's really important. I think I would suggest like stay in the loop in terms of finding out what's going on with the prison, speak to the head of reducing reoffending. That networking and partnership working is really, really important at this time, because, you know, the through the gate work is mostly done by voluntary sector organizations like ourselves. So I'd suggest, you know, really trying to work on that and just focus on that. So hopefully that's been useful. And I'll pass you back to Matt then.
A huge thank you, Michelle, very much so in terms of being useful. Really, really insightful getting that view from the ground and behind closed curtains. So thank you very much for it. And just a reminder to everyone on the call, Michelle's the voluntary sector coordinator at HMP Isis. If you're interested in delivering work or supporting people there, not just in relation to early releases, but wider voluntary sector work, please do reach out to Michelle to start a conversation, or of course, pop a question in the chat bar for later. Once again, a huge thank you, Michelle. Okay, now comes the point when I cross my fingers and hope that most of you don't all drop off the call. It's my segment on the agenda. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the London system in terms of what voluntary sector support has been commissioned to support prison leavers on housing needs, and what additional resources are available to people next week during the first tranche of early releases. I do have some slides which hopefully will be appearing on your screens now. And with a bit of luck, it will move on to the second slide. Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. First, I realise many people on this call work in the wider homelessness sector, and so you may not be aware of how the criminal justice system is structured and operates. So by way of very quick background, HMPPS, His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, is the key relevant agency of the Ministry of Justice. As the name strongly suggests, HMPPS is responsible for prisons and probation across England and Wales. I believe most people on the call will be aware of the core function of prisons. They're responsible for the custodial element of sentences issued by courts. Probation, on the other hand, are responsible for the community element of sentences. So when an individual is released having served 50% of their sentence in prison, or 40% as of next week, to serve the remainder of their sentence in the community, that remaining 60% will be under the supervision of probation. HMPPS also has wider stated aims, including trying to change lives by rehabilitating people who find themselves in their care. So how does it do this? Well, one of the ways is by commissioning support and rehabilitation services from the voluntary sector. It typically does this on a regional basis with 12 geographic regions across England and Wales. Now, for the purpose of this discussion over the next few minutes, I'm going to summarise the main voluntary sector commissioning partners in the London region, who I know have been working very closely with probation and prisons to support people being released as part of SDS 40 next week. So on accommodation, HMPPS commissioned two main voluntary sector organisations to provide accommodation support to prison leavers in London. Those are St Mungo's and Single Homeless Project. St Mungo's, and I'm sure most of you know, is a leading national homelessness charity. Their criminal justice in custody services supported more than 3,400 people nationally last year. St Mungo's provide housing advice services in all 10 adult male London estate prisons and in 26 of London probation sites in London, often working in partnership with Single Homelessness Project, who provide, amongst other things, supported hostels and services in London to people released from prison. On the next slide now, I'm going to summarise some of the major aspects of St Mungo's and Single Homeless Project's housing support and how they do that in London. This isn't an exhaustive list, but I wanted to highlight a few things. Firstly, how they have housing advice specialists providing one-on-one support across London prisons and probation sites to facilitate action plans. They have and do provide vital accommodation such as hostels or semi-independent housing, and with it, crucial casework support to help people work through the difficulties such as addiction. I also want to highlight the importance of HARP in London, the Housing Advice, Resettlement and Prevention Project. That's a pan-London support service for people released over the age of 25 with complex needs. The aim being to equip people with the skills and confidence to maintain tenancies in the future. I also want to speak about how their facilitation of staging post accommodation is vital, even though that accommodation is only temporary. We heard about the importance of CAS 3 from Jeremy earlier for prison leavers, basically putting a roof over someone's head and buying some more time whilst the search for more suitable longer-term housing is sourced. Now, it's important to note that these housing support services take place all year round in prisons and with probation. What's unique about SDS 40, however, is the fact that because of the sheer number of people involved and being released early, it meant that housing discussions and planning for people who may be at risk of homelessness began much earlier than usual. There was noticeable earlier engagement. So it'd be really interesting to see what results in terms of homelessness cases arise during these early releases. Hopefully it will result in a much lower proportion of people being homeless, and lessons can be learned about starting earlier and working more collaboratively. It is, however, also important to draw attention to some of the challenges that exist and contribute to not everyone having a roof over their head when they are released. My colleague Sam spoke about some of these earlier, so I'll just pick up some different ones. First major issue, it's an obvious one, is simply the huge shortage of affordable housing. And this is particularly felt in London due to the high rents. In practice, this means that any under 25 or under 35-year-old will not be able to rent from a private landlord in London due to benefit caps, not to mention other requirements such as enormous deposits now being required upfront to secure a rented room. And I saw some chat about that in the chat bar earlier. That obviously limits the number of accommodation options St Mungo's and Single Homelessness Project have, and indeed other voluntary organisations working in this space have significantly to draw upon and discuss with people presenting to them. Next issue to highlight is how support from commissioned housing support services are usually only accessible after being referred from probation. That can be time consuming, essentially waiting to be processed and be on their radar, even when you're still in prison. You're still waiting for probation to process you and become aware of your case. You typically cannot self-refer or be referred by another organisation anymore, whereas that was the case in the past. Again, this really does delay the process sometime. The final point I want to make is how heavily bureaucratic the entire process is, along with the strict eligibility criteria. It takes a long time to complete checks, going back and forth with admin, obtaining sign-off on things like personal action plans that have been drawn up to help an individual. So it's complicated, it's difficult. People can fall through the gaps as part of these official processes, which is why something called through the gate support is so important. And on that note, on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so through the gate support is provided with the aim of creating a seamless transition between prison and the community, thereby reducing re-offending. Basically trying to give people the best possible start as they walk through the door upon release by troubleshooting practical issues and providing mentoring support on a wide range of matters. Now, it takes many guises, and each prison in London works with various voluntary sector organisations providing through the gate support, each one brilliantly impactful in their own way, and guiding people on a wide range of issues from accommodation to benefits and finance to education, training and employment. And it really is great seeing so many of them on the call today, including Dan from Switchback, for example. I'd like to focus, however, on the through the gate support specifically arranged by London prisons as a group and region to support the large number of people being released during the first SDS 40 tranche next week. This dedicated support for early releases has been imaginatively called Meet at the Gate rather than Through the Gate, and Catch 22 have been commissioned to provide it. It includes the following: meeting people at the gate and offering to accompany them to their post-release appointments, directing to CAS 3 accommodation and probation offices, providing care packages, travel cards, SIM cards and phones to those applicable for that, and meeting people at London Railway mainline terminals who've been released from prisons outside of London but are returning to their areas. Catch 22 and St Mungo's staff will also be stationed inside London probation delivery units on Tuesday, the 10th of September, to assist with any referral needs of people being released that day. Final slide, please, Paul, if that's okay. Thank you. So, in terms of what about is to happen next week, I have to say that I'm quite optimistic, or maybe actually I'll rephrase that now and say hopeful as a more appropriate word. That's because there really does seem to have been significant pre-release planning work completed, certainly in London, in advance of SDS 40 next week. This really could lower the proportion of people being released into homelessness than typically been seen before. And that result would come about because SDS 40 basically forced pre-release planning to begin earlier, which combined with the enhanced support on the day could really add to best practice when it comes to releases and preventing homelessness. We've also been assured that agencies such as London Probation will be reviewing with commissioned voluntary sector partners what happens during Tranche 1 next week to learn any lessons from it before Tranche 2 begins the month after. Before I finish, I just wanted to highlight a couple of places to go for more information, and that might actually answer some of the questions in the chat function. The first is the Clinks Directory of Services. It's a unique and brilliant resource where you can find details of voluntary organisations working in your specific location, specialising in whatever niche you are interested in. For example, mentoring, addiction services, arts, gambling support, you name it. That's the strength of the sector. This may be useful if you're supporting someone with accommodation currently or next week, but wanted to signpost them to another voluntary sector organisation for additional support. So the website for our Clinks Directory of Services is www.clinks.org/directory, and it should be on your screen as well. The second option that I wanted to highlight to you is what to do if you're interested in offering your services, for example, accommodation that you might have as part of the SDS 40 process. We've been told to ask you to please contact the head of OMU, Offender Management Unit, at your local prison, if that is the case, to potentially discuss further and connect you with whatever existing provision and arrangements are in place. If you need any assistance with obtaining your head of OMU's contact details, just get in touch with Clinks. Okay, that's the end of my segment. You'll be relieved to hear, and I'm even more relieved to hear that you're still here and see that. I'm now going to hand back to Jeremy at Homeless Link, who's going to talk us through the next stages with regards to Mentimeter before questions and answers. Jeremy, over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt. That was a fantastic presentation, and thank you so much for sharing that. So now I'm just going to share my screen again. So we'll be asking people to get back onto Mentimeter in just a second. So hopefully you can see that. So there's the code to join. So it's 35622087. So that'd be fantastic. So again, the reason why we're so keen to get feedback is, as funded by London councils, we provide back information to them on the impact of our events, and it's really vitally important that we're able to capture as much as we possibly can to continue evidencing to them the impact that we're having and the difference that this is making for the sector across the board. So we'll keep that screen up there so you can have that. It's easy to hand the code, and then we'll go through that as we go. But in terms of questions, there are a few that I'll sort of answer now. I think there are some really useful ones that were brought up by different people. So Caitlin Rantham, is there a solution to significant barriers to accessing PRS? I find a main barrier is having a guarantor. Is there a solution to service users not having a guarantor? So really local authorities, they play a really important part, obviously, in ensuring that homelessness is prevented, often through the housing options team responsible for PRS lettings internally at the local authority and working in close relationship with their local landlords. There are often incentives available for landlords and funding to pay them up front to secure tenancies. So I think that's a really useful place to go, as sort of your local housing options team, if that guarantor problem is preventing somebody from moving in. A really good question from Tara Moore. Do we know if there will be funding for PRS providers like ourselves in London to be able to access in order to support as many clients as possible without having to rely on council AFIO referrals or to work in partnership with, as we offer accommodation and tenancy sustainment for 1 year? So at this stage, we aren't aware of specific funding. However, we are regularly feeding in these concerns and issues to central government as part of our regular ongoing intelligence gathering and reporting as a partnerships team, and we'll continue raising these issues to them as we're very conscious of the additional pressures that will be placing upon the sector. We've got a question from Alex Rose. Is Street Link still the final last stop option to signpost people who, despite all efforts, find themselves released with no accommodation on release? If so, could they look at dropping the requirement for them to be rough sleeping at night in order to access the service? So thanks for that question, Alex. I think Street Link is definitely still an option for signposting people and should be used in terms of that. And I think that specific query that you've raised there, that's something that we may be able to take away, as I'm aware that there is work being explored to break down any kind of barriers to ensure that people are appropriately supported and that any blocks are removed wherever possible to prevent further rough sleeping, and really working and responding in a flexible way and proactive way, and also pragmatic way as well, as much as possible. And finally, there's a question from Sarah Lofts. How are we managing those released who are suffering with long-term health conditions? They may find themselves released requiring medication and may have been deregistered from a GP practice whilst in prison. What support or advice is given to register with a GP practice practically if they find themselves homeless? So I think first and foremost, effective signposting and linking in with relevant health services and agencies, that will be vitally important here, to ensure that people can access that healthcare and, a GP where needed. And again, prior to release from prison, there should be good connections made to relevant local substance misuse and health services as part of that wider kind of risk and safety sort of assessment around the individual before they leave prison, so that those things should be picked up. In terms of supporting those individuals and ensuring there's a really good plan in place. And I think it's important to also remember that everybody has a right to access GP services, and not having an address of being homeless, that shouldn't be a barrier. Although often that's sort of thought to be the case, that you need to have a registered address, but you don't in order to access a GP service. And there are also many different sort of homeless health GP services operating across different areas as well. And there's local integrated care board arrangements, as well as safeguarding and wider local authority public health arrangements that should be able to advise and support locally as well. So I think I'll now hand back over to Matt.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeremy. Superbly comprehensive answers when, quite frankly, put on the spot with this. So really, really appreciate it. And I think everyone in the audience does as well. We're still sifting through all of them. I think we've answered most of them. A couple have just popped up now, which I feel like could answer them. The first one is, do you have to be a member of Clinks to be involved in feeding into policy development? That was by Carolyn. Very easy one for me there. No, you do not need to be a member of us. But we hope you will become a member of us by doing that process. We really would like members to join us, and we feel we add a lot of value. So I hope that you do get involved with us and then join us. Emma, if I could hand over to you just to explain what we're going to do with the policy questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. My name's Emma Kidger. I'm the Support and Development Manager here at Clinks. And I am currently sifting through all the amazing questions that we've received through this event. there's quite a few in relation to policy development, which will be related to Sam's presentation that he gave earlier, as well as the ongoing engagement that he referred to that we are having with government officials around STS 40. So you'll see where we haven't answered some of them verbally, it's because we want to sort of take them away. We're taking all the questions away and make sure that we've got all the feedback and the questions that we can then include in the sort of next stage of engagement that we're going to be that's going to be taking place following the first tranche in preparation for the second. So don't think we've ignored them if we haven't come to them directly or if they haven't been answered as part of the presentations that have happened today. As Matt said, we will be continuing this ongoing engagement and involvement with Homeless Link to make sure that we are able to hear everybody's views, hear the voices that are coming through. There's a few questions in here that I think have now retrospectively been asked by the end of the presentations. And there's a few references to some of the things that Sam spoke to, such as the wellbeing hubs. I know that was a question from Suzanne. In some of the SIG accommodation reports, there's evidence of those best practice pieces. So it's a case of going through them and sort of having a look for them. But yeah, I guess any questions that are unanswered, we will hopefully, as part of the sort of follow-up from this event, be able to send a pack of resources alongside some of the presentation slides with any other signposting as well. Jeremy, I'm not sure whether there's a few that are more sort of related to Homeless Link in terms of some of the housing legislation that I'm just sifting through. I don't know if you've seen any that have come out that you wanted to kind of draw upon, but otherwise we can do that as part of a follow-up from the event.
Yeah, I'm happy, Emma. If you wanted to, feel free to kind of read those out, and then we can go through them. I'd be very happy to at least try and answer as best I can.
Great. Well, thank you, Tara. We've had lots of questions from you around this. So one of them is around, do you know whether CAS 2 and CAS 3 providers have additional access to funding to support move on into PRS, including tenancy sustainment, other than AFEO through councils to support move on? Are they getting extra funding to support with STS 40?
Yeah, I think it will probably be a similar answer to the other, I think, question around funding. I think it's extremely important that we're constantly feeding these queries around funding back to central government, just because often it's the case with these new either programs or initiatives or schemes that the government launch. They often feel like maybe a useful idea or a great idea, actually, but without the funding to back the providers who are then having to do the work, it makes things, or it can make things extremely difficult and challenging. So that's something that will just continue feeding back, I think, because we're not aware of any particular funding, and it is an explicit question that we have asked.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. I've just seen Michelle is going to answer a couple of the prison-related questions. Thank you, Michelle. Over to you.
Yeah, I just saw that another question from Tara about the ID and bank accounts, because I think that's a question that's come up multiple times about obviously making sure that service providers and all this kind of aspects like benefits have been set up. So obviously I'm speaking from an ISIS perspective and best practice perspective. Just like any type of release, all these things should be in place. So if you've, obviously in terms of ISIS, we found out from last month that people were getting released. It's been a substantial amount of time for the ID paperwork to have started, the bank account paperwork to have started, the benefits to have started. So here, obviously in ISIS, we have a universal credit worker there. And in terms of those processes, they should all be done as a normal release should be done. In terms of obviously ID and bank accounts being done in time for the 10th of September, that's a different story. This is when obviously it's really important for those workers to get the information in terms of any post-release addresses that could be used. So if information can be posted through the post, and obviously I know that's quite frustrating for housing, because it's quite important to get the ID and bank accounts ready. But the process should be the same. Like Jeremy was saying earlier as well, with the mental health referrals and the GP referrals, all the referrals should be the same as it would have been for any type of release. I think it's just understanding that there's a little bit of there's a higher caseload to work with. So you might not be able to get all the ID and bank accounts, everything done in time, but just like that would be in a normal situation, to ensure that follow-on addresses or follow-on next of kin, or, those, or even sending it back to probation, those kind of follow-on details have been taken into consideration for passing on that information forward. So I think that's one of the things I've noticed a few questions about that it should be the same process as a normal release. And there should be that follow-on, worker or that follow-on probation where all that stuff can be sent to ensure that that person can then gain their accommodation and gain the ID bank accounts and universal credit information, because they should be still having the paperwork in terms of the day of release, universal credit appointments. All those things have been put into place knowing that there's going to be a high number of releases on that day. So all those things should be done.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. And I think that actually speaks to a couple of the other questions we've got in the chat around the take-home message of prison releases are following SDS 40 should be treated as business as usual and everything else should be done. So, for example, there's a question from Sarah around avoiding Friday releases. That should still be the case under SDS 40. It shouldn't be that Friday releases happen as a result of this, of these two tranches. I've seen that, Alex, thank you. You've reposted your question, which is a really good one. So thank you for sort of bringing it back to my attention. So to your knowledge, is any work being done to challenge the stigma and stereotypes that some people in prison feel towards accessing supported accommodation, especially options through probation, such as approved premises? Many people in prison feel that accommodation is not safe for other aspects of their desistance journey, for example, recovery from drugs or alcohol. Many people in prison believe that most APs are, quoting, sort of full of sex offenders and people on drugs. So it's a really good question around work being done to challenge stigma and stereotypes. I'm not sure if any of the speakers on the call are aware of any of that work that's taking place in regards to that.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I'm aware of some work that's being done. I mean, in terms of what we do as a partnerships team, not just in London, but across the country, is we're often working with local homelessness forums who are then working with their local communities. And often there is that sort of addressing the stigma around these types of issues and looking at how, you can work with the local authority to maybe improve communication. So I think a really good example of that was in Bristol a few years ago. So I was in a commissioning role in Bristol before doing this role a few years ago. And something that we did there was really try and share people's stories and just sort of show the reality of these issues. And actually, we're all human in this. There isn't sort of this, second-rate kind of citizen, which is often what people facing these issues or in these situations are, played out to be. So I think, there are some really good examples of work there, but also across the country where I think, again, in partnership across the local authority and other relevant sort of local organisations, there is work that can be done, whether it's through sharing people's stories or finding different ways of just trying to educate the general public on what these issues are, and breaking down that stigma can be really powerful.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for that answer. It's really, really helpful to hear your insights there. I will go through a couple more and then I'll hand back to Matt and Jeremy just to sort of round up the event. And as I say, it doesn't mean any questions that haven't been answered verbally won't be answered long term. We've got one around local authorities expecting probation to share OASIS documents or previous convictions with the local authority. We've had probation services refuse to provide these, which poses a risk to staff. I know that on some of the calls I've been on with wider sort of official engagement, there has been, that question has been asked around information sharing between prisons, probation, local authorities as part of SDS 40. And I know there have been some challenges due to the sheer volume of the amount of risk assessments that have had to take place in order to equip the probation services to be able to do to be able to support people coming through the gate. As far as I'm aware, I mean, refusal to provide any sort of risk information is not best practice, because risk information should be shared. But I don't know, again, if Jeremy, you've heard of anything about local authorities sort of not receiving or not being able to share them? Or Matt, I see you've appeared, if you want to share anything on that as well.
I mean, I think from my perspective, there isn't anything specific that we've heard of as yet, but I'd be really keen if there are kind of specific examples that people have, please do share them with me. We'd be really keen to collate those and then potentially feed them back to relevant stakeholders. So whether that's sort of having a conversation with local authorities or even back to central government in terms of how these processes are undertaken, yeah, do feel free to get in touch.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, I can see people answering each other's questions, which is a dream because the expertise is in the room. So Matt, I'm going to hand back to you for any final bits and bobs.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone. That concludes this Clinks and Homeless Link event on early release and homelessness. I really hope you found it informative and, dare I say, enjoyable too. I know I have. A huge thank you to Jeremy White from Homeless Link, Sam Julius and Michelle Lendrum from Clinks for being our guest speakers. And also an enormous thank you to Emma Kidger, Paul Wiltshire and Joni Emery for bringing it all together behind the scenes. My name's Matt. I hope you've got my contact details. Just get in touch via the usual emails if not. On behalf of everyone at Clinks and Homeless Link, a massive thank you for joining us today. You'll hear from us soon regarding a follow-up event and a publication. Thank you again, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.